A racist cop's hand closes around a black woman's arm in a silent courtroom. He thinks she's nobody, just another face to humiliate, another body to drag away. But when she raises her badge, his world shatters in an instant. What he doesn't know, she's been watching him for months. This is the story of the moment justice stopped hiding and started staring back. Stay until the end, this gets wild. And comment your city below so I can see how far this truth travels. The Anderson County Courthouse smelled like old wood and older secrets. It was the kind of building where justice wore a mask of mahogany paneling and brass fixtures, where the American flag hung in the corner like an ornament rather than a promise. The ceiling fans turned lazy circles overhead, pushing warm air that tasted of furniture polish and fear. People whispered in these halls. They always had. Adrienne Row sat in the last row of courtroom 4B, her red blazer a small flame in an ocean of beige and gray. She'd chosen that seat deliberately close enough to see everything far enough to be dismissed, invisible by design. She'd been sitting there for 47 minutes, her leather portfolio balanced on her knees, a silver pen tucked behind her ear. To anyone watching, she looked like a paralegal, maybe a law student observing proceedings. Someone forgettable. That was exactly what she wanted. The morning docket was routine traffic violations, petty theft, a domestic dispute continuation. Judge Patricia Moreland presided with mechanical efficiency, her reading glasses perched on her nose, her gavel tapping like a metronome. The bailiff, a heavy-set man named Morris, stood by the side door with his arms crossed, eyes half closed in boredom. Adrienne's pen moved across her notepad in careful strokes. She wasn't taking notes on the cases. She was documenting something else entirely. 10 to 23 a.m. Defendant Garcia asked to speak. Judge interrupted within 4 seconds. Tone dismissive. 10:31 a.m. Public defender attempted objection. Overruled before full sentence completed. 10:40 a.m. Woman in row. 3. Latina approx. 30s asked to use restroom. Request denied. No explanation given. Patterns. That's what Adrienne saw. Patterns that most people missed because they happened in the margins, in the pauses between words, in the way certain faces got softer treatment while others got stone. The courtroom door opened. Adrienne didn't look up immediately, but she felt the change in air pressure, the way conversations died mid-whisper. She'd learned to read rooms the way some people read books. Every entrance, every exit, every shift in energy told a story. Officer Bryson Hale walked in like he owned the oxygen. He was 42 years old, 6'1", with the kind of build that came from high school football glory and 20 years of protein shakes. His uniform was crisp, his badge polished to mirror brightness. His jaw was set in that particular way men learn when they've never been told no. Not really, not in a way that mattered. His eyes swept the courtroom with practiced authority, categorizing, judging, dismissing. When they landed on Adrienne, they stopped. She felt it before she saw it, that particular quality of attention that wasn't curiosity, but assessment. The kind of look that measured worth in seconds, and found it lacking. Adrienne kept writing. Hale's boots clicked against the tile floor as he moved down the center aisle. He wasn't walking toward the front. He was walking toward her. The room seemed to hold its breath. Stand up. His voice cut through the murmured conversations like a blade through silk. Not loud, but absolute. The kind of command that expected obedience without question. Adrienne finished her sentence before looking up. Her expression was neutral, almost curious. Excuse me. Her voice was quiet, professional. A question without challenge. I said stand up. Hale's hand moved to his belt fingers, drumming against the leather. Not threatening, not yet, but suggesting. When an officer of the law enters a courtroom, you show respect. Around them, people shifted in their seats. Some looked away. Others leaned forward, smartphones already emerging from pockets and purses like mechanical witnesses. Adrienne set her pen down carefully, precisely in the spiral binding of her notebook. I wasn't aware that was a legal requirement, she said. Her tone remained even measured. Not argumentative, just factual. Something flickered across Hale's face, surprise maybe, or irritation that his authority had been questioned, however mildly. "It's a matter of courtesy," he said, his jaw tightening. "Something you clearly weren't raised with." The words hung in the air like smoke. In the front of the courtroom, Judge Moreland's gavel paused mid-descent. The bailiff's eyes opened fully for the first time that morning. A woman in row 5 sucked in her breath sharp enough to hear. Adrienne's expression didn't change. She'd heard worse. She'd been preparing for worse. "Officer," she said quietly, "I'm here observing a public proceeding. I have every right to. You have the right to show respect or leave." Hale took a step closer. "Your choice. Make it quick." The red blazer suddenly felt very red, very visible. Adrienne could feel the weight of every eye in the courtroom, the way attention had pivoted entirely to this corner, to this confrontation that had materialized out of nothing and routine prejudice. She remained seated. Not defiantly, that would come later in the reports and the headlines. In this moment, she simply continued to exist in the space she had every legal right to occupy, doing the work she'd been sent here to do. "Ma'am." Hale's voice dropped lower, more dangerous. "This is your final warning." "Officer Hale." Judge Moreland's voice finally cracked through the tension. "Is there a problem?" Hale didn't turn around. His eyes stayed locked on Adrienne, and in them she saw something ancient and familiar. The particular rage of men who mistake power for righteousness, who confuse uniform with authority that can never be questioned. "No problem, Your Honor," he said. His words directed at the judge, but his gaze fixed on Adrienne. "Just reminding this individual about proper courtroom decorum." "The court has not required anyone to stand," Moreland said carefully. Adrienne heard the hesitation in her voice, the way authority bent when it recognized another kind of power, even when that power wore a badge instead of a robe. "With respect, Your Honor, I'm handling a disruption." "I haven't disrupted anything," Adrienne said, and now there was steel beneath the silk of her voice. "I'm sitting quietly observing a public hearing, which is my constitutional right." "Your constitutional right?" Hale's laugh was short, sharp, mean. "Let me tell you about rights, sweetheart. You don't get to lecture me about the Constitution while disrespecting— I'm not your sweetheart." The words dropped like stones in still water. Hale's face flushed. His hand moved from his belt to his radio, then back to his belt, searching for the next move, the next assertion of control. "Stand. Up. Now." Adrienne looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the file she'd been building for 6 months. The complaints that had been filed and buried. The women who'd sat in these same seats and been humiliated for crimes as simple as existing in the wrong skin, speaking in the wrong language, showing the wrong amount of deference to men who'd confused a badge with a crown. She thought about Alma Trenton, whose photograph she'd found in a box of disposed cases in the courthouse basement. Alma dragged from a courtroom 8 years ago for contempt that was never formally charged, never officially recorded, never properly investigated. She thought about all the women who'd been erased from official record, but not from memory. And she made her decision. "No," she said simply. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Hale's hand shot out and clamped around Adrienne's upper arm. "Then you're coming with me." His grip was iron, sudden, shocking in its violence. Adrienne felt her body being yanked upward, her portfolio falling from her lap and scattering papers across the floor, careful documentation, 6 months of evidence fluttering like wounded birds across the tile. "Get your hands off me." Her voice was louder now, clear, carrying to every corner of the room. "You had your chance." Hale pulled harder, hauling her toward the aisle. Her shoulder socket screamed in protest. Her feet scrambled for purchase on the floor. Around them, phones rose like a forest of eyes. Someone gasped. Someone else said, "Oh my God." The bailiff started moving toward them, but slowly, uncertainly, as if approaching a car accident he didn't want to witness, but couldn't look away from. "Officer Hale, release her." Judge Moreland stood, her gavel finally falling with real force. "This is not—" "She's resisting," Hale barked, and there it was, the magic word, the justification, the explanation that had worked 1,000 times before, in 1,000 different courtrooms, with 1,000 different victims who didn't have witnesses, didn't have phones, didn't have anything but their word against his. Adrienne's hand went to her blazer pocket. Hale saw the movement and yanked harder, spinning her around, reaching for his handcuffs with his free hand. "Don't you dare resist arrest!" "I'm not resisting anything," Adrienne said, and her voice cut through the chaos like a bell through fog. "I'm identifying myself." Her hand emerged from her pocket. The badge caught the fluorescent light like a small sun, gold and federal, and absolutely unmistakable. The letters were clear, even from the back row, FBI Internal Oversight. Bryson Hale froze. His hand was still locked around her arm, his body still bent in the aggressive posture of control. But his face went through a transformation that Adrienne had seen before, but never tired of witnessing. Confusion first, then recognition, then the terrible dawning horror of a man who'd just walked off a cliff and hadn't yet hit the ground. "What?" His voice cracked. "That's not, you can't—" "Special Agent Adrienne Row." She spoke clearly, projecting to the back of the room, to the phones recording every second to the future that was already writing itself in real time. "FBI Internal Oversight Division. I'm conducting an investigation into systemic civil rights violations in this courthouse. You have approximately 3 seconds to remove your hand from my person before I add assault on a federal officer to the charges you're already facing." Hale's hand opened like he'd been burned. He stumbled backward, his face cycling through shades of red and white and gray. His mouth worked soundlessly, searching for words, for explanations, for the reset button that didn't exist. "This is—" He looked at Judge Moreland, then at the bailiff, then back at Adrienne, his world reorganizing itself in real time. "This is entrapment. You were sitting there, you were—" "I was observing a public proceeding," Adrienne said calmly, though her arm throbbed where his fingers had dug in. "Which is my job. What's your excuse for physically assaulting a citizen who is exercising her constitutional rights?" "I didn't know you were—" "Would it have mattered?" The question cut like a scalpel. If I'd been a paralegal, a law student, a woman waiting for her case to be called, would any of those identities have given you the right to put your hands on me? Silence. The kind of silence that has weight, that presses down on everything it touches. Judge Moreland sank back into her chair, her face pale. The bailiff stood frozen halfway down the aisle. In the gallery, people held their phones steady, recording, witnessing, preserving this moment for whatever came next. Adrienne bent down and began collecting her scattered papers. Her hands were steady, professional. She didn't rush. "Your Honor," she said, still gathering her documentation, "I'm going to need this courtroom sealed. As of this moment, everyone present is a witness in a federal investigation. Bailiff Morris, please secure all exits. No one leaves until they've provided contact information to my team." "Your team?" Hale's voice rose, desperate now. "You don't have jurisdiction here. This is a county courthouse. You can't just—" Adrienne straightened her portfolio, reassembled her badge, still visible in her other hand. "Title 18 U.S. Code Section 242. She said, her voice quiet but absolute. "Deprivation of rights under color of law. When a law enforcement officer acting under governmental authority willfully deprives a person of their constitutional rights, it becomes a federal crime. My jurisdiction isn't a question, Officer Hale. It's a fact." She turned to address the courtroom, her voice carrying to every corner. "My name is Special Agent Adrienne Row. For the past 6 months, I've been investigating allegations of systematic civil rights abuses in this courthouse, specifically targeting women of color, immigrants, and economically disadvantaged defendants. What you witnessed here today was not an isolated incident. It's a pattern. She pulled out her phone, pressed a number on speed dial. "This is Row. I need a team at Anderson County Courthouse, courtroom 4B. Full audit protocols. Yes, now." She paused, listening. "Because I've just been physically assaulted by Officer Bryson Hale in front of 47 witnesses while conducting an official observation. The situation is active." Hale's face was the color of old paper. "I want my union rep," he managed. "I'm not saying anything without—" "That's your right," Adrienne said. "You also have the right to remain silent, though based on the last 5 minutes, I'd say you've already waived that one pretty enthusiastically." A sound rippled through the courtroom. Not quite laughter, but something close. Release, maybe. The nervous energy of people who'd seen power shift so suddenly, they were still processing the physics of it. Adrienne looked at each person in the room, her gaze steady, inclusive. "I need statements from everyone who witnessed what happened here. You're not in trouble. You're not suspects. But your testimony matters. What you saw, what you heard, what you felt, when you watched an officer of the law put his hands on a woman whose only crime was sitting quietly in a public space that matters. The truth matters." An older black woman in row 3 raised her hand slowly like a student afraid of the wrong answer. "Ma'am, Agent Row, I've seen him do this before. Not exactly this, but similar. To my niece, last year. She filed a complaint, but nothing happened." Adrienne's expression softened. "What's your name?" "Cynthia Washington." "Ms. Washington, I'm going to need you to tell me everything, every detail. And I promise you." Her voice strengthened, filled with certainty that came from knowing the machinery of justice was finally turning in the right direction. "I promise you this time, someone is listening." Another hand went up, then another, then 5 more. Stories began pouring out like water from a broken dam. Small humiliations, casual cruelties, the 1,000 tiny cuts that power inflicts on the powerless when it thinks no one important is watching. Hale stood in the center of it all, his authority evaporating like morning dew under a federal sun. He looked at Judge Moreland one more time, searching for rescue, for intervention, for someone to restore the order he'd always known. She looked away. The courtroom doors opened. 3 agents in dark suits entered, their FBI credentials already visible. Their expressions professionally neutral, but their eyes sharp, cataloging everything. "Agent Row," the lead agent said. "Building is secured. We've got teams going through record storage now." "Good." Adrienne handed him her notebook. "Start with these case numbers. Cross-reference with complaint files. I want to know how many reports were buried, how many videos went missing, how many women were told their experiences didn't matter enough to investigate." She turned back to Hale one last time. "You asked me about respect," she said quietly. "Here's the thing about respect, officer. It's not something you demand. It's something you earn. And you can't earn it by making people afraid of you. You can't earn it by putting your hands on citizens who won't bow. You can't earn it by hiding behind a badge while trampling the very rights that badge is supposed to protect." Hale's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Adrienne walked past him, her red blazer bright as a warning flare, heading toward Judge Moreland's bench. "Your Honor, I'm formally requesting all video footage from this courtroom for the past 24 months, all complaint files related to Officer Hale, and all disciplinary records for courthouse security personnel." Moreland nodded slowly. "Agent Row, I want to cooperate fully with your investigation." "That's good," Adrienne said, "because cooperation is mandatory, not optional. I'll need your calendar as well. Every session Officer Hale has attended, every defendant he's interacted with, every moment his authority overlapped with your courtroom." The judge's face tightened, but she nodded again. Adrienne walked back to her seat in the last row. The papers were scattered across the floor, her carefully maintained invisibility shattered into 1,000 pieces of evidence and testimony and witnessed truth. She sat down. The red blazer settled around her shoulders like armor she'd been wearing all along, but had only now revealed. She pulled out her pen, opened her notebook to a fresh page, and began writing again. 11:47 a.m. Subject Hale physically assaulted federal agent conducting lawful observation. 47 witnesses. Multiple phone recordings. Pattern confirmed. Investigation expands. Behind her, Officer Bryson Hale was being read his rights by one of the FBI agents. His hands were shaking. His voice, when he tried to protest, sounded small and lost the voice of a man who'd built his entire identity on a foundation of unquestioned power, only to discover it was sand all along. Adrienne didn't watch. She didn't need to. She'd seen this moment coming for 6 months, had built toward it, case by case, document by document, buried complaint by buried complaint. She'd sat in this courtroom 12 times before today, watching Hale operate, cataloging his patterns, waiting for the moment he'd reveal himself completely. And he had. Not because she'd provoked him, but because she'd simply existed in a space he believed belonged to him, refusing to make herself smaller to accommodate his ego. That was all it took in the end. Just the quiet insistence on occupying space. Just the refusal to disappear. The courtroom was transforming around her from a place of routine injustice to a crime scene, from a theater of casual cruelty to evidence of systematic failure. Agents moved through the rows, taking statements, collecting contact information, building the framework of accountability that had been missing for so long. Ms. Washington was crying softly as she spoke to an agent, finally saying words she'd held inside for a year, finally being heard. A young Latina woman approached Adrienne Row hesitantly. "Agent Row, my name is Maria Santos. I was here 6 months ago, and Officer Hale, She swallowed hard. "He said I didn't belong in America. He said I should go back where I came from. I'm from Houston." Adrienne looked up, her expression gentle. "Tell me everything, Maria. Every word, every detail. You matter. Your story matters. And I'm going to make sure everyone knows it." Maria nodded, tears streaming down her face, and began to speak. The afternoon sun slanted through the courtroom windows, dust motes dancing in the light like small witnesses to transformation. Outside news vans were already pulling into the courthouse parking lot, drawn by the scent of a story that would crack open like an egg, revealing truths that had been hidden in plain sight. But inside courtroom 4B in the last row, Adrienne Row sat with her red blazer and her federal badge and her careful documentation, doing the work that justice required when no one was watching, and especially when everyone was. She thought about Alma Trenton, somewhere out there, who'd been dragged from a courtroom 8 years ago and had never gotten the apology she deserved. She thought about all the women whose names she'd found in disposed files, in buried complaints, in the margins of official history. She thought about the young black intern who would someday sit in this chair and not be touched, not be threatened, not be made to feel small because someone with a badge decided she didn't belong. And she kept writing, because the story wasn't over. It was just beginning. And this time it would be told in courtrooms and in congressional hearings and in training manuals, and in the collective memory of everyone who'd witnessed what happened when power finally had to answer for itself. The chair in the last row had changed. It wasn't just a seat anymore. It was evidence. It was testament. It was the place where silence had finally spoken loud enough to shatter the machinery of injustice that had run smoothly for far too long. And Adrienne Row sat in it like it had always been hers, because it belonged to anyone brave enough to occupy space in a world that constantly demanded they disappear. The truth was simple, really. She hadn't broken the system. She'd just made it look at itself, and what it saw would change everything. The FBI field office in downtown Anderson was a study in controlled chaos by 3 o'clock that afternoon. Adrienne stood in conference room B, watching as agents transformed the space into a war room. Whiteboards lined the walls, already filling with names, dates, case numbers. A digital projector threw spreadsheets across the far wall, like accusations made of light. Special Agent Marcus Chen dropped a cardboard box on the conference table with a thud that made everyone look up. "Basement records," he said, pulling off latex gloves. Took us 2 hours just to find them. Someone moved them 3 times in the last year, each time deeper into storage, further from anything resembling organized filing. Adrienne opened the box. The smell of mildew and neglect rose up. Inside were manila folders, some so old the edges had gone soft, the ink fading into ghosts of official documentation. How many? She asked. This is box 1 of 17, Chen said. And that's just what we found in the first sweep. The courthouse administrator suddenly remembered a storage unit off-site about 20 minutes ago when we mentioned obstruction charges. Adrienne pulled out the first file. The name on the tab was written in blue ballpoint, the handwriting, Careful Feminine Complaint, Rodriguez Carmen. Officer Misconduct. She opened it. The report inside was dated 4 years ago. Carmen Rodriguez, 28 at the time, had filed a formal complaint after Officer Bryson Hale detained her during a child custody hearing. According to her statement, he'd accused her of being disruptive when she'd asked the bailiff a question in Spanish. The detention lasted 3 hours. No charges were filed. No explanation was given. At the bottom of the report, stamped in red ink, resolved. No further action required. Resolved, Adrienne said softly, her finger tracing the word. They spelled buried wrong. Agent Sarah Kim looked up from her laptop. We're finding a pattern in the database. Every complaint filed against Hale goes through a specific review chain. Guess who sits on that chain? Tell me it's not Judge Moreland, Chen said. Worse, County Sheriff Thomas Bridges, Hale's former training officer and current golf buddy. Kim turned her laptop around to show a photograph pulled from the Sheriff's Department website. 2 men in uniform, arms around each other's shoulders, holding a trophy. The caption read, Sheriff Bridges and Officer Hale, Annual Charity Tournament Champions. Adrienne set down the Rodriguez file and pulled out another. Then another. The names blurred together, but the stories were horrifyingly similar. Women of color, immigrants, single mothers, all accused of vague infractions, failure to comply, disruptive behavior, lack of proper respect, all marked resolved without investigation. They weren't just looking away, she said. They built a system designed to look away. Every step, every checkpoint, every review, it's all theater. The conclusion was decided before the complaint was even filed. Her phone buzzed. A text from Agent Williams, still at the courthouse, found the video archive. You need to see this. 20 minutes later, Adrienne was standing in a windowless room in the courthouse basement, watching security footage on a monitor that had seen better decades. The timestamp read June 15, 2019. The video showed courtroom 4B from a high angle. Officer Hale entered. A black woman in her 50s sat in the third row, hands folded in her lap. She was well-dressed, professional, her posture suggesting someone who'd spent a lifetime navigating spaces that didn't want her. Williams paused the video. That's Dr. Alma Trenton, he said. Professor of Constitutional Law at Howard University. She was here for a hearing related to her nephew's traffic violation. Supposedly, she was removed for contempt of court. Supposedly? Watch. Williams pressed play. On screen, Hale approached Dr. Trenton. The audio was poor, but Adrienne could read body language like poetry. Hale said something. Trenton looked up, responded calmly. Hale's posture changed, shoulders back, chest forward, the universal language of escalation. Trenton remained seated. Hale reached for her arm. What happened next took 11 seconds. 11 seconds of a federal law professor being dragged from her seat, her papers scattering, her dignity being stripped away in front of 40 witnesses, while a bailiff stood watching and a judge did nothing. The video cut to black. That's it, Adrienne asked. That's all that exists in the official archive, Williams said. But here's the interesting part. This footage was requested by Dr. Trenton's attorney 6 years ago as part of a civil suit. They were told the camera malfunctioned that day. The footage didn't exist. But we're watching it. Because I found it on a backup drive that was supposed to be wiped 3 years ago. Someone didn't follow through. Williams opened another file on his laptop. And that someone was Bradley Morris, the bailiff. He kept a personal archive of what he called problematic incidents. My guess insurance in case he ever needed leverage. Adrienne stared at the frozen image Dr. Trenton mid-drag, her face a mask of shock and rage, and something deeper than either recognition. The recognition that came when the law you'd spent your life studying and teaching and believing in revealed itself to be optional, negotiable, only applicable to certain people in certain circumstances. "Where's Morris now?" Adrienne asked. "Retired last year, living in Florida. But he's willing to talk. Actually, he's eager to talk. Apparently, he's been waiting for someone to ask the right questions." Adrienne pulled out her phone and dialed. It rang 3 times before a man's voice answered, rough with age and cigarettes. "This is Bradley Morris." "Mr. Morris, this is Special Agent Adrienne Row, FBI. I understand you have information about Officer Bryson Hale's conduct in Anderson County Courthouse." There was a long pause. Adrienne heard the ocean in the background, waves breaking against some distant shore. "I have more than information," Morris said finally. "I have evidence. I have recordings. I have a conscience that's been eating me alive for 20 years because I watched things I should have stopped, and I told myself I was just doing my job." "Tell me about Dr. Alma Trenton." Morris exhaled long and slow. "She was the turning point. You have to understand, Agent Row. I'd seen Hale operate for years. The casual racism, the power trips, the way he treated certain people like they were less than human. But with Dr. Trenton, it was different. She wasn't some scared kid or immigrant who didn't know their rights. She was a law professor. She knew exactly what he was doing, and she called him on it." "What did she say?" "She told him he was violating her Fourth Amendment rights. She told him his conduct was unlawful. She said it calmly, clearly, like she was teaching a class. And that's what set him off. Not that she was black, not that she was a woman, though those things mattered, but that she had the audacity to know the law better than he did." Adrienne closed her eyes, seeing it unfold. The professor facing down the officer, armed with nothing but knowledge and dignity. The officer realizing his authority meant nothing against someone who understood the actual machinery of justice. "He dragged her out." Morris continued, his voice thick with regret. "And I stood there. I stood there and watched, because that's what bailiffs do. We maintain order. We don't question. We don't intervene. We're furniture with badges." "Why didn't you come forward then?" "Because I was a coward." The words came out flat, factual, past the point of self-pity. "Because I had a mortgage and 2 kids in college and a pension I'd been paying into for 18 years. Because I told myself it wasn't my fight. Because every time I thought about speaking up, Sheriff Bridges would remind us in staff meetings about loyalty, about the brotherhood, about how we protect our own." "What changed?" "I saw my granddaughter get her law degree last year. Howard University. Same place Dr. Trenton taught. And I thought about what would happen if some cop decided she didn't show enough respect, didn't bow low enough, didn't make herself small enough to accommodate his ego. I thought about her sitting in a courtroom, knowing her rights, speaking her truth, and some Bryson Hale deciding that was reason enough to put his hands on her." Morris's voice cracked. "I can't undo what I didn't do," he said. "But I can give you every piece of evidence I kept. Every video, every incident report that got buried, every complaint that disappeared. I documented everything because some part of me knew this day would come. Someone would finally ask. Someone would finally care enough to look." Adrienne opened her notebook. "Mr. Morris, I'm going to need you to send me everything. And then I'm going to need you to testify." "I'll do both," he said. "On one condition." "What's that?" "Find Dr. Trenton. Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her I should have done better. Tell her the silence ends now." The line went quiet except for the sound of waves. "I'll tell her," Adrienne said. "You have my word." She hung up and looked at Williams. "Get me everything Morris has. Cross-reference it with the complaint files. I want to see how many incidents we're really talking about." By 8 o'clock that evening, The conference room looked like a museum of institutional failure. The whiteboards were covered in names and dates, lines connecting incidents like a conspiracy theorist's fever dream, except this conspiracy was real and documented, and had been hiding in plain sight for 2 decades. Agent Kim stood in front of the largest whiteboard, marker in hand. Okay, here's what we know. From 2015 to present, Officer Bryson Hale has been involved in 47 documented incidents of what the department classified as courtroom management. Of those, 39 involved women. Of those, 34 involved women of color. Of those, 28 resulted in physical contact, grabbing, detaining, removing from courtroom. She paused. Let the numbers sink in. 0 resulted in formal disciplinary action. 0 resulted in retraining. 0 resulted in any consequences whatsoever beyond a notation in a file that was then buried in a basement. Chen leaned back in his chair. What about the other 8? The ones that weren't women of color? 3 were white women with public defenders so economically vulnerable. 2 were Latinas who didn't speak English fluently. 1 was a transgender woman. 1 was a domestic violence victim who talked back to the judge. And 1 was a 16-year-old black girl waiting for her mother's hearing who committed the crime of chewing gum. Adrienne felt something cold settle in her chest. This wasn't just about one racist cop. This was about a system that had given him permission, cover, and 20 years of unchecked authority. What about the videos? She asked. Williams pulled up a spreadsheet. Morris's archive contains footage from 63 incidents over 12 years. The official courthouse archive lists 17 of those 63 as camera malfunction or technical error. 24 more are listed as footage corrupted. The remaining 22 aren't listed at all, as if they never happened. So they weren't just burying complaints, Adrienne said. They were erasing evidence. Systematically, Kim agreed. And it gets worse. I pulled the personnel files for everyone involved in the complaint review process. Sheriff Bridges, the county administrator, the courthouse security director, they've all received complaints about other officers too. Similar patterns, similar resolutions, similar disappeared videos. Adrienne walked to the window. Outside, Anderson looked peaceful streetlights coming on, people heading home from work. The ordinary rhythm of a town that had no idea its justice system was being dismantled in a federal field office 6 blocks from the courthouse. Her phone rang. Unknown number. This is Row. Agent Row. My name is Patricia Moreland. The judge's voice was tight, controlled, the sound of someone making a call they'd been dreading. I'd like to speak with you. Off the record. There is no off the record in a federal investigation, Your Honor. Then on the record, please, I need to tell you what I know. They met at a diner on the edge of town, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like regret. Moreland sat across from Adrienne, her hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't touched. I should have stopped him today, the judge said without preamble. I should have stopped him years ago. Why didn't you? Moreland looked out the window at the parking lot at nothing. Because I told myself it wasn't that bad. Because I convinced myself that managing a courtroom meant managing personalities, and Hale had always been difficult. Because every time I raised concerns with the sheriff or the county administrator, I was told I was overreacting, being too sensitive, not understanding how hard it is for officers to maintain order. She finally met Adrienne's eyes. Because I was afraid, she said quietly. Afraid of being labeled a problem judge. Afraid of losing support from law enforcement. Afraid that if I pushed too hard, I'd end up transferred to some rural circuit where I'd spend my days adjudicating livestock disputes instead of real law. So you sacrificed other women's dignity for your career. Moreland flinched, but didn't look away. Yes, that's exactly what I did. And I've been living with that knowledge for 8 years, since the day Bryson Hale dragged Professor Alma Trenton from my courtroom, and I sat there and let it happen because speaking up felt too dangerous. Do you know what happened to Dr. Trenton? I know she filed a civil suit that was settled quietly. I know the terms included a non-disclosure agreement. I know she never taught in Virginia again. Moreland's hands tightened around her mug. I know she probably looks at judges now and sees cowards in robes. Adrienne pulled out her phone and showed Moreland a photograph from Morris's archive. Dr. Trenton mid-drag, her face captured in that terrible moment of realization. She didn't just see a coward, Adrienne said. She saw a system that chose silence over justice. She saw every person in that room who looked away. Every person who told themselves it wasn't their problem. Every person who decided that maintaining the status quo was more important than protecting someone's civil rights. Moreland's eyes filled with tears. What do you need from me? Everything. Every incident you witnessed, every complaint you heard about, every time you were told to look the other way, every conversation with Sheriff Bridges about managing difficult officers, every settlement that made problems disappear. They'll destroy me, Moreland whispered. They already destroyed you. Adrienne said, not unkindly. You've been living with this for 8 years. The only question now is whether you're going to let it keep destroying other people. The judge nodded, slowly pulled out her phone and began scrolling through old emails. I kept records, she said. I told myself it was just good practice, but really, I think I knew someday someone would ask. Someday the bill would come due. She forwarded 17 emails to Adrienne's secure account. Subject lines blurred past Rehail incident. Let's discuss. Complaint procedure question. Concerned about courtroom conduct. There's more, Moreland said. Last month, a young public defender named Rachel Sims came to my chambers. She said Hale had been targeting her clients, making them wait longer, speaking to them more harshly, finding reasons to detain them after hearings. She wanted to file a formal complaint. What did you tell her? Moreland's voice dropped to barely a whisper. I told her to be careful, that Hale had powerful friends, that making waves could hurt her career before it even started. She looked up, tears streaming down her face now. I told a 26-year-old lawyer to accept injustice because fighting it was too dangerous. What does that make me? Adrienne didn't answer. Some questions had to sit with the person who asked them. Where's Rachel Sims now? She asked instead. Still here, still fighting, braver than I ever was. Back at the field office, the night shift had arrived. Agent Kim was on her third coffee cross-referencing court transcripts with incident reports. Chen was on the phone with the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division, his voice patient as he explained for the third time why this case mattered. Adrienne added Moreland's emails to the evidence file and stood back looking at the full picture. 47 documented incidents. 63 videos, most erased or hidden. 17 boxes of buried complaints. One system designed not to see, programmed to look away, built to protect the powerful and abandon everyone else. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unfamiliar number. This is Rachel Sims. Judge Moreland said you wanted to talk. I have files you need to see. They met in Rachel's apartment, a studio above a bookstore where law books competed with houseplants for space. Rachel was young, fierce, with the kind of determination that hadn't been beaten down yet by years of compromise. She dropped a thick folder on her kitchen table. Client documentation, she said. Every time one of my clients had an interaction with Hale, I noted it. Date, time, what was said, what happened. My supervising attorney told me I was being paranoid, that I was seeing racism where there was just normal law enforcement. Adrienne opened the folder. The notes were meticulous, detailed, damning. March 3, 2024. Client Yvonne Harper. Black female. 34, detained after hearing for suspicious behavior. Behavior asking when she could leave. Detention, 90 minutes. No charges. April 17, 2024. Client Miguel Santos. Latino male. 29, told to speak English or leave when requesting translator. Court-appointed translator was present in building. May 2, 2024. Client Jennifer Wu. Asian female, 22, accused of being disrespectful for making eye contact with Hale. Threatened with contempt. The list went on. Page after page of systematic degradation, casual cruelty, the slow grind of injustice masquerading as law and order. "Why didn't you go public?" Adrienne asked. Rachel laughed, bitter and young. "I tried. I went to the County Bar Association. They said I didn't have standing to file a complaint on behalf of clients. I went to the State Civil Rights Commission. They said courthouse security was a local matter. I went to the ACLU. They said they didn't have resources for individual cases callback if I could prove a pattern." You proved a pattern. "I'm a first-year public defender with student loans and a boss who thinks I'm too aggressive. Who's going to listen to me?" She looked at Adrienne with eyes that had seen too much too soon. "But you're listening. You're actually listening. Why?" "Because I sat in that courtroom for 6 months," Adrienne said. "I watched Hale operate. I saw the fear in people's faces when he walked in. I saw how they made themselves smaller, quieter, less visible, trying to avoid his attention, like he was a predator and they were prey. And I realized this wasn't about one bad cop. This was about what happens when good people decide that stopping one bad cop is too hard, too risky, too damaging to their own interests." She closed Rachel's folder carefully. "You did the right thing. You documented. You spoke up. You kept trying even when everyone told you to stop. That matters." "Did it?" "Because from where I'm sitting, all I did was make my clients more vulnerable and my career more fragile. You built a record, and that record is going to help tear down a system that should never have existed." Adrienne stood. "I need you to testify. Everything you documented, every conversation you had with supervisors, every time you were told to look away, I need it on the record." Rachel was quiet for a long moment. "If I do this, I'm done in Anderson County. Maybe done in Virginia. Public defenders who make waves don't get second chances." "No," Adrienne said. "Public defenders who make waves change the law. They become the people who write the training manuals and teach the ethics courses and stand up in courtrooms and say, 'Never again,' with the full force of precedent behind them." Rachel smiled, small and fierce. "When do you need me?" The hearing was scheduled for 10 days later. Federal courthouse, 3 judges, full press coverage. In those 10 days, Adrienne's team processed 17 boxes of evidence, interviewed 63 witnesses, and built a case that read like an indictment of institutional rot. The night before the hearing, Adrienne sat alone in the conference room, reading through testimony one more time. Her phone rang. "Agent Row, this is Dr. Alma Trenton." Adrienne sat up straighter, her heart suddenly loud in her ears. "Dr. Trenton, I've been hoping to reach you. Bradley Morris called me." The professor's voice was cultured, controlled, carrying the weight of 8 years of forced silence. "He said I should talk to you. He said things were finally going to change." "I hope so. I'm trying to make sure they do. Agent Row, I need you to understand something. When Bryson Hale dragged me from that courtroom, it wasn't just humiliation. It was erasure. I spent my life teaching constitutional law. I taught my students about equal protection, about due process, about the rights that are supposed to make us all equal before the law. And in 11 seconds, a man with a badge proved it was all theoretical, all conditional, all revocable the moment someone with power decided you didn't deserve it." Dr. Trenton's voice strengthened. "I signed a non-disclosure agreement because I was tired, because I wanted to move on. Because they paid me enough money that I could tell myself it was a victory. But it wasn't. It was surrender. It was choosing silence over justice, because justice felt impossible." "It's not impossible," Adrienne said. "Not anymore. How can you be sure? Because tomorrow every piece of evidence your erasure tried to hide will be presented to federal judges. Because Bradley Morris is testifying. Because Rachel Sims is testifying. Because 47 women who thought their stories didn't matter are going to discover they mattered all along. There was a long silence. "I'd like to be there," Dr. Trenton said quietly. "If that's permitted." "It's more than permitted. It's necessary." The line went quiet again, but different this time. Not empty, but full of years of silence, finally breaking, full of wounds, finally witnessed, full of the terrible necessary hope that comes when justice stops being theoretical and starts being real. "Thank you, Agent Row," Dr. Trenton said finally, "for being the person who looked." Adrienne hung up and stared at the evidence spread across the conference table. 47 documented incidents, 63 videos, 17 boxes of buried complaints, and one woman sitting in the last row of a courtroom refusing to stand, refusing to disappear, refusing to let the system look away anymore. The bill was coming due, and tomorrow everyone would have to pay. The federal courthouse in Richmond was built to intimidate. Marble columns rose like accusations toward vaulted ceilings, and the morning light cut through tall windows in sharp geometric patterns that divided the floor into territories of shadow and exposure. Adrienne arrived at 7:30, 2 hours before the hearing, because she'd learned long ago that preparation was the difference between justice and theater. Agent Chen was already there setting up the presentation equipment with the methodical precision of someone who knew that technical failures could derail truth as effectively as lies. "Audio check," he said, and his voice echoed through the empty courtroom like prophecy. Adrienne set down her briefcase and looked at the room. 3 judges would sit at the elevated bench. Witnesses would testify from a stand positioned directly beneath the seal of the Department of Justice. Gallery seats stretched back in neat rows, each one a potential witness to whatever happened here today. She thought about all the courtrooms where justice had failed quietly, where power had gone unchecked, because no one was watching, or everyone was watching, but no one was willing to speak. This wouldn't be one of those rooms. Not today. By 8:30, people began arriving. Adrienne watched them file in, recognizing faces from her investigation. Carmen Rodriguez, who'd been detained for speaking Spanish 4 years ago, entered with her daughter holding her hand. The daughter couldn't have been more than 8, wearing a dress too formal for her age, like she understood this was important, even if she didn't understand why. Miguel Santos came next, the young man Rachel Sims had represented, the one who'd been told to speak English or leave. He wore a suit that didn't quite fit the sleeves, slightly too long, and Adrienne could see him tugging at the collar like it was strangling him. Then came the wave of women whose names filled 17 boxes of buried complaints. They entered quietly, almost apologetically, as if they still believed taking up space was an act of transgression. Some were alone. Some brought family members or friends. All of them carried the particular weight of people who'd been told their pain didn't matter enough to investigate. Rachel Sims arrived at 8:45, her public defender's badge visible on her lapel like armor. She caught Adrienne's eye and nodded, her jaw set, with the determination of someone who'd decided that fear was less important than truth. At 8:57, Dr. Alma Trenton walked through the courtroom doors. The room didn't gasp, didn't erupt, didn't acknowledge her entrance with anything obvious. But Adrienne felt the shift, the way oxygen seemed to reorganize itself around this woman, who'd been erased from official record, but not from memory. Dr. Trenton was 61 now, her hair silver, her posture military straight. She wore a navy suit and carried herself like someone who'd spent 8 years learning how to rebuild dignity from fragments. She sat in the 3rd row, same position she'd occupied in Anderson County 8 years ago. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Bradley Morris entered at 9:03, looking smaller than Adrienne had imagined from his voice on the phone. He was 72, retirement soft, his bailiff's uniform replaced by khakis and a button-down shirt. But his eyes held something fierce, something that had been waiting 2 decades to speak. At 9:15, the side door opened and Officer Bryson Hale entered, flanked by 2 attorneys. He'd lost weight in 10 days, his uniform hanging slightly loose, his face carrying the particular pallor of someone who'd discovered that invincibility was always an illusion. His eyes swept the gallery and stopped when he saw Dr. Trenton. Something flickered across his face. Recognition maybe, or the terrible arithmetic of consequences finally adding up. Sheriff Thomas Bridges sat in the back row, his arms crossed, his expression carved from stone. He hadn't been charged with anything yet, but his presence felt like a dare, like a man who still believed his power could outlast evidence. At 9:30 precisely, the three federal judges entered. Chief Judge Helena Okoye took the center seat, her expression neutral, but her eyes sharp. To her left sat Judge Michael Brennan Young for the bench at 49, known for his technical precision. To her right sat Judge Ruth Yamamoto, 73 years old, and legendary for her refusal to tolerate institutional bullshit. "All rise," the clerk said, and the room stood as one. The hearing began with opening statements. The federal prosecutor, a woman named Victoria Barnes, with 20 years of civil rights cases behind her, laid out the government's case with surgical precision. She spoke for 17 minutes, outlining a pattern of systematic abuse that had operated under the cover of courtroom security for 2 decades. "What we will prove today," Barnes said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room, "is not simply that Officer Bryson Hale violated the civil rights of citizens under his authority. We will prove that he was permitted to do so, encouraged to do so, and protected when he did so by a system designed to prioritize order over justice, compliance over constitutional rights, and silence over accountability." Hale's lead attorney, a man named Douglas Freeman, who specialized in police defense, stood for his opening statement. He was good. Adrienne had to admit. He spoke about the difficult job of law enforcement. The split-second decisions required the challenge of maintaining order in chaotic environments. "Officer Hale is not on trial for being perfect," Freeman said. "He's being judged for 20 years of service, during which he made thousands of decisions, the vast majority of which were proper and professional. What we have here is a handful of incidents being cherry-picked and recontextualized to suggest a pattern that simply doesn't exist." Judge Okoye looked at him over her reading glasses. "Counsel, we have 47 documented incidents and 63 videos. That's not a handful. That's a habit." Freeman's smile tightened. "We look forward to providing context for each of those incidents, Your Honor." The first witness was Bradley Morris. He walked to the stand like a man approaching confession, his hand shaking slightly as he swore to tell the truth. Prosecutor Barnes approached him with the gentleness of someone handling explosives. "Mr. Morris, you served as a bailiff in Anderson County Courthouse for 23 years, is that correct?" "Yes, ma'am." "During that time you worked alongside Officer Bryson Hale?" "Yes, ma'am. Starting in 2003 when he was first assigned to courthouse duty." "Can you describe Officer Hale's approach to his duties?" Morris took a deep breath. Adrienne watched him glance at Dr. Trenton, saw something pass between them that might have been apology or recognition or both. "At first he seemed like any other officer, professional, focused on security. But over time I noticed patterns. Certain people got more attention than others. Certain people got treated with more suspicion." "What kind of people?" "Objection," Freeman said, rising. "Calls for speculation." "I'm asking what the witness observed, Your Honor," Barnes said. "Overruled. The witness may answer." Morris cleared his throat. "Black women mostly, Hispanic women, women who didn't speak English as their first language, women who seemed educated or professional, those seemed to bother him most, like they were challenging him just by existing." "Can you give us a specific example?" Morris nodded slowly. June 15, 2019. Dr. Alma Trenton was in courtroom 4B waiting for her nephew's hearing. She was sitting quietly, not causing any disruption. Officer Hale entered and immediately focused on her. He walked directly to her row and told her to stand up. Did she comply? She asked why, politely. She didn't raise her voice, didn't use profanity. She just asked a simple question: why am I being asked to stand? What happened next? Morris's voice dropped. Officer Hale told her she was being disrespectful. Dr. Trenton explained she was a law professor and that there was no legal requirement for her to stand. That's when Hale grabbed her arm and pulled her out of her seat. In the gallery, Dr. Trenton sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her face composed. But Adrienne could see her knuckles were white. "What did you do?" Barnes asked. "Nothing." The word came out like a wound. "I stood there and watched. I told myself it was his call to make, that I was just the bailiff, that my job was to maintain order, not question it." "Did Dr. Trenton resist?" "No, she went limp, not fighting, but not cooperating either. Peaceful resistance. Officer Hale dragged her anyway. 11 seconds from first contact to her being removed from the courtroom. I know because I've watched the video about 1,000 times since then." "Why did you keep that video?" Morris looked directly at Hale for the first time. "Because I knew it was wrong. I knew someday someone would ask about it, and I wanted to have proof. I wanted to have evidence that I witnessed it, even if I didn't have the courage to stop it." Freeman's cross-examination was aggressive but ineffective. He tried to suggest Morris had a grudge, had been passed over for promotions, had fabricated evidence. But Morris had brought documentation, his personal archive time-stamped, unedited, corroborated by courthouse records that had survived the purge. The second witness was Carmen Rodriguez. She took the stand with her daughter watching from the gallery, her voice quiet but steady. Barnes walked her through the incident from 4 years ago, the detention for speaking Spanish, the 3 hours of humiliation for the crime of using her first language. "Did you file a complaint?" Barnes asked. "Yes. I filled out the forms, submitted them to the courthouse administrator. I was told someone would investigate." "Did anyone contact you?" "No. 2 months later, I received a letter saying my complaint had been reviewed and resolved. No explanation, no apology. Just resolved." "How did that make you feel?" Freeman objected. "Relevance, Your Honor." "I'll allow it," Judge Okoye said. "The emotional impact of civil rights violations is relevant to damages and to establishing pattern and practice." Carmen looked at her daughter, then back at Barnes. "It made me feel like I didn't matter, like my dignity was negotiable, like the law only protected some people, and I wasn't one of them." Freeman tried to discredit her during cross-examination, suggesting she'd been disruptive, that she'd refused to comply with reasonable requests. But Barnes had the video from Morris's archive, and when it played on the courtroom monitors, showing Carmen sitting quietly while Hale loomed over her, demanding she speak American. Freeman's questions died in his throat. The morning progressed with witness after witness. Miguel Santos testified about being told to speak English, despite having a court-appointed translator present. Jennifer Wu described being accused of disrespect for making eye contact. Yvonne Harper recounted 90 minutes of detention for asking when she could leave. Each story was different in its details, but identical in its architecture. Power asserting itself against powerlessness, authority, mistaking compliance for respect, a badge being wielded as permission to humiliate rather than protect. By lunch recess, the pattern was undeniable. The afternoon session began with Rachel Sims taking the stand. She was nervous, her public defender's professionalism barely containing the fury of someone who'd watched injustice operate daily and been told to accept it. Barnes approached her with the folder of documentation. Rachel had kept the meticulous notes that had seemed paranoid until they became evidence. "Ms. Sims, you documented 31 interactions between your clients and Officer Hale over the course of 14 months. Can you explain why you kept such detailed records?" "Because I stopped believing in coincidence," Rachel said. "The first few times I thought maybe my clients were just unlucky. But after the 10th time watching Officer Hale single out my clients who were disproportionately people of color, disproportionately poor, disproportionately vulnerable, I realized this wasn't random. This was systematic." "Did you report your concerns?" "To everyone who would listen. My supervising attorney told me I was being oversensitive. The County Bar Association said I didn't have standing. The State Civil Rights Commission said it was a local matter. I felt like I was screaming into a void. What made you keep trying? Rachel's voice strengthened. Because my clients deserved better. Because the law is supposed to protect everyone equally, and if it doesn't, then we're not practicing law, we're just maintaining a hierarchy where some people have rights and others have permissions that can be revoked at will. Judge Yamamoto leaned forward. Ms. Sims, in your professional opinion, did Officer Hale's conduct constitute a pattern of civil rights violations? Absolutely. And not just his conduct, the system that protected him. Every complaint that disappeared, every video that was erased, every time someone in authority chose to look away rather than intervene, that's part of the pattern too. Freeman's cross-examination tried to paint Rachel as a crusader with an agenda, someone who saw racism everywhere because she wanted to find it. But Rachel had facts, documentation, and the particular credibility that comes from being the only person in the room who'd been willing to see what everyone else ignored. At 3 o'clock, Adrienne took the stand. Barnes led her through the investigation methodically. The 6 months of observation in courtroom 4B. The decision to maintain cover until Hale revealed himself. The moment he grabbed her arm, and the badge that changed everything. Agent Row, why didn't you identify yourself immediately when Officer Hale first approached you? Because I needed to see how he treated someone he perceived as powerless. If I'd flashed my badge immediately, he would have modified his behavior. I needed to experience what every other woman in that courtroom had experienced when they sat in that same seat and dared to exist without permission. And what did you learn? Adrienne looked directly at Hale. I learned that his authority was entirely dependent on intimidation. That when confronted with someone who knew their rights and refused to be intimidated, his only tool was physical force. And I learned that this wasn't improvisation. This was practiced, refined, perfected over years of being allowed to operate without consequences. Freeman stood for cross-examination, his strategy clearly to discredit the investigation as entrapment. Agent Row, isn't it true that you deliberately provoked Officer Hale by refusing to comply with his lawful order? I refused to comply with an unlawful order. Adrienne corrected. There is no legal requirement for citizens to stand when an officer enters a courtroom. Officer Hale invented that requirement and enforced it with violence. You sat in that courtroom for 6 months without identifying yourself. Isn't that deceptive? Undercover observation is standard investigative practice. What's deceptive is a system that pretends to deliver justice while systematically stripping certain people of their constitutional rights. Freeman tried several more angles, but Adrienne had testified in dozens of federal cases. She knew how to answer questions directly while making every answer build the case against institutional failure. At 4:30, Barnes called her final witness. The government calls Dr. Alma Trenton. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as Dr. Trenton walked to the stand. She moved with the same dignity Adrienne had seen in the video, the same refusal to be diminished that had triggered Hale's rage 8 years ago. She swore to tell the truth, sat down, and looked directly at the 3 judges. Barnes approached gently. Dr. Trenton, can you tell us what happened on June 15, 2019? I was in courtroom 4B waiting for my nephew's traffic violation hearing. I'm a constitutional law professor, so I'm familiar with courtroom procedure. I was sitting quietly reviewing notes for a lecture I was preparing on Fourth Amendment protections. Her voice was measured academic, but underneath Adrienne heard the current of pain that 8 years hadn't diminished. Officer Hale entered the courtroom and walked directly to where I was sitting. He told me to stand up. I asked why not confrontationally, just seeking clarity. He said I was being disrespectful by questioning his authority. I explained that I was within my rights to remain seated during a public proceeding. That's when he grabbed my arm. Can you describe what that felt like? Dr. Trenton's composure cracked slightly. Like being erased. I've spent my entire career teaching students about constitutional rights, about equal protection under law, about the principles that are supposed to make us all equal before the justice system. And in 11 seconds, a man with a badge demonstrated that all of it was theoretical. All of it was conditional. All of it could be revoked the moment someone with power decided I'd failed to show sufficient deference. Did you file a lawsuit? Yes. It was settled with a non-disclosure agreement. I was paid money to be silent about what happened to me. At the time, I told myself it was pragmatic. I was exhausted from fighting. But what I really did was accept payment for my dignity, and I've regretted it every day since. Barnes paused, let the words settle. Dr. Trenton. Do you know someone named Marcus Trenton? Dr. Trenton smiled small but genuine. He's my son. He's currently a congressional representative from Maryland's 4th District. He's leading a national effort to reform qualified immunity protections for law enforcement. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Okoye's gavel came down twice. Order. Counsel, is this relevant? It goes to impact your honor. Dr. Trenton's experience didn't just affect her. It created a ripple that led to national policy discussions. Her son has testified before Congress about watching his mother be dragged from a courtroom for the crime of knowing her rights. Freeman objected, but his heart wasn't in it. The damage was done not to his case, which was already collapsing under the weight of evidence, but to the mythology of isolated incidents and misunderstood contexts. Barnes had one more question. Dr. Trenton, why are you here today? You signed a non-disclosure agreement. You could face legal consequences for testifying. Dr. Trenton looked at Hale, then at Sheriff Bridges in the back row, then at the gallery filled with women who'd suffered similar erasures. Because silence is complicity. Because I was paid to disappear, and I did. And while I was gone, Officer Hale hurt more people. Because my son is trying to change the law, but laws only matter if someone enforces them. And because I want every woman sitting in this courtroom to know that what happened to them wasn't their fault, wasn't acceptable, and wasn't something they have to carry alone anymore. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Freeman declined to cross-examine. At 5:15, Judge Okoye called for a 30-minute recess. The attorneys disappeared into separate conference rooms. The gallery remained seated, no one wanting to leave, as if movement might break whatever spell truth had cast over the proceedings. Adrienne sat in the prosecutor's conference room reviewing notes for closing arguments when her phone buzzed. Text from an unknown number. This is Officer James Chen, Anderson County Sheriff's Department. I need to speak with someone, today, before this gets worse. She showed the text to Barnes. James Chen, Barnes said. 28 years old, on the force for 4 years. He was at the courthouse the day you arrested Hale. What do you think? I think someone's conscience is making noise. Barnes looked at the clock. We have 23 minutes. Let's see what he has to say. Officer Chen met them in a small witness room down the hall. He was young Asian American, his uniform pressed, but his face haggard like he hadn't slept in days. He sat down without being asked, his hands shaking. I need immunity, he said immediately. For what? Adrienne asked. For not speaking up sooner. For watching things I knew were wrong and telling myself it wasn't my place to interfere. He looked up, his eyes red. For being part of the system that protected Hale. Barnes pulled out a legal pad. Tell us what you know. Chen took a shaky breath. During academy training, we had unofficial sessions, not on any curriculum, just senior officers talking to recruits. They told us how to handle difficult situations, how to establish authority, how to manage problematic individuals. He paused. They used code, but the message was clear. Be firm with black women. They're more likely to challenge you, more likely to question authority, more likely to need stronger reminders about respect. Adrienne felt her jaw tighten. Who said this? Multiple instructors, but the clearest version came from Sheriff Bridges himself. He told us, some people are raised to respect the badge, some aren't. Your job is to teach them, and teaching isn't always gentle. Did anyone object? Chen laughed bitter. One recruit asked if that wasn't, profiling. Bridges said profiling was pattern recognition based on experience, and experience taught him that certain demographics required different management strategies. You're willing to testify to this under oath. I'll testify to everything. The training sessions, the unofficial guidance, the way complaints got buried, the culture that said protecting other officers was more important than protecting citizens' rights. His voice cracked. I joined this job to help people. Instead, I became part of a machine that hurt them. I can't carry that anymore. Barnes looked at Adrienne. We need him on the stand. Agreed. At 6 o'clock, court reconvened. Judge Okoye looked surprised to see the prosecution calling an additional witness, but Barnes had filed the proper motion during recess. The government calls Officer James Chen. The young officer walked to the stand like a man approaching execution. The gallery shifted, recognizing his uniform, uncertain what this meant. Barnes didn't waste time. Officer Chen, you're currently employed by the Anderson County Sheriff's Department, correct? Yes, ma'am. And you're here voluntarily testifying against the interests of your employer and your colleagues? Yes, ma'am. Why? Chen looked at Dr. Trenton, at Carmen Rodriguez, at the rows of women who'd been told their dignity was negotiable. Because I was taught wrong. Because the culture of my department prioritized loyalty over justice. Because I've watched good people get hurt by bad systems, and I've done nothing, and I can't do nothing anymore. What were you taught? Chen's testimony was devastating. He detailed the training sessions, quoted Sheriff Bridges, directly described the culture that treated civil rights violations as acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of order. He admitted to witnessing incidents he didn't report to, looking away when he should have spoken up, to being complicit in a system that had rotted from the inside. By the time he finished, Sheriff Bridges had left the courtroom. Freeman's cross-examination was brief, almost perfunctory. What could he say? The system had confessed through one of its own. Closing arguments began at 7:30. Freeman tried to salvage something, arguing that individual incidents needed context, that law enforcement faced impossible situations, that mistakes didn't equal malice. But his words felt hollow against the mountain of evidence, the chorus of testimony, the video footage that proved pattern and practice beyond any reasonable doubt. Barnes's closing was surgical. Your Honors, we have proven that Officer Bryson Hale systematically violated the civil rights of citizens under his authority for over 2 decades. We have proven that he was trained to do so, encouraged to do so, and protected when he did so. We have proven that complaints were buried, videos were erased, and victims were silenced through a system designed not to deliver justice, but to avoid accountability. She paused, let the silence build. But this case isn't just about one officer. It's about what happens when institutions choose comfort over courage, when good people decide that stopping injustice is too hard or too risky, when the machinery of justice becomes a machine for maintaining hierarchies of power. Dr. Alma Trenton didn't break any law. She simply existed in a space while black, educated, and unwilling to perform subservience. And for that, she was erased from official record, paid to be silent, and left to carry the weight of systemic failure alone. Barnes looked at each judge in turn. Agent Adrienne Row sat in that courtroom for 6 months because she understood that justice requires witnesses, that truth demands courage, and that sometimes the only way to make a system face itself is to refuse to look away. She didn't break the system, Your Honors. She made it look in the mirror, and what it saw should horrify all of us. The judges retired to deliberate at 8:45. The gallery remained seated, exhausted but unable to leave. Adrienne stood in the hallway drinking terrible coffee from a vending machine when Dr. Trenton approached. Agent Row, Dr. Trenton, I wanted to thank you for seeing, for caring enough to act. Adrienne shook her head. I'm sorry it took so long. I'm sorry you had to wait 8 years for someone to believe you. You gave me something better than belief, Dr. Trenton said quietly. You gave me validation. You proved that what happened to me wasn't in my head, wasn't my fault, wasn't something I deserved. You gave me my story back. The judges returned at 9:30. All rise. Judge Okoye spoke for the panel, her voice carrying the weight of federal authority and human recognition of suffering witnessed. We find unanimously and without reservation that Officer Bryson Hale engaged in a systematic pattern of civil rights violations spanning 2 decades. We find that he was enabled, protected, and encouraged by institutional structures designed to avoid accountability rather than ensure it. We find that the Anderson County Sheriff's Department, the courthouse administration, and the complaint review process all functioned not as safeguards against abuse, but as mechanisms for perpetuating it. She looked directly at Hale. Your badge gave you authority to protect citizens' rights, not permission to violate them. You have betrayed that trust systematically, deliberately, and without remorse. You are hereby suspended from duty pending criminal charges. Your qualified immunity is stripped. You will face the full weight of federal civil rights prosecution. Her gaze shifted to the gallery. To every person who testified here today, who found the courage to speak truth to power, despite years of being told that truth didn't matter, you have changed the law. Your testimonies will be entered into the federal record. They will be taught in law schools, cited in cases used to train officers in what justice requires when it stops being theoretical and becomes real. Judge Okoye's voice softened slightly. Justice doesn't begin with power. It begins with how we respond to the abuse of power. Today you responded. Today you were heard. Today the silence ends. The courtroom erupted not in cheers, but in something deeper. Release maybe. Recognition. The sound of burdens finally being shared after years of being carried alone. Adrienne watched cameras flash, watched reporters surge forward, watched Dr. Trenton embrace her son who'd arrived during deliberations. She watched Carmen Rodriguez cry into her daughter's hair, watched Rachel Sims collapse into a chair, with the exhausted relief of someone who'd finally been proven right. And she watched Officer Bryson Hale being led away in handcuffs. His face empty now, the power that had defined him stripped away like costume jewelry revealed as fake. The system hadn't been broken today. It had been forced to see itself, and in that, seeing everything changed. The news broke before midnight, spreading across social media like wildfire in dry grass. By morning, the video of Hale grabbing Adrienne's arm had been viewed 14 million times. The hashtag #JusticeInTheLastRow was trending in 43 states. Cable news devoted entire segments to what they were calling a watershed moment in civil rights enforcement. Adrienne watched none of it. She sat in her hotel room at 2 a.m, writing her report to the FBI's Civil Rights Division, documenting every detail with the same precision she'd brought to the investigation itself. The victory in court was just the beginning. Now came the harder work of making sure victory translated into actual change, rather than performative gestures that would fade when the cameras moved on. Her phone buzzed constantly. Interview requests from CNN, MSNBC, NPR, The New York Times, The Washington Post. A literary agent wanted to discuss book deals. A producer from Netflix asked about documentary rights. A speaking agency offered her a spot on the lecture circuit at $5,000 per appearance. She deleted every message. This wasn't about her. It had never been about her. And the moment she made it about her, the moment she accepted the crown of heroism that the media wanted to place on her head, the story would shift from systemic failure to individual triumph, and nothing would actually change. At 6 a.m, her supervisor called. "Row, you've got the director's office on line 2. They want to congratulate you personally." "Tell them I'm writing my report." "They're the director's office. And I'm an agent with evidence to document. The congratulations can wait until the work is done." She hung up and kept writing. By 7:30, her report was complete. 87 pages of detailed analysis connecting Hale's individual actions to broader patterns of institutional failure, recommending wholesale review of courthouse security protocols nationwide, suggesting policy changes that would prevent future erasures. She sent it to her supervisor, copied the Civil Rights Division, and marked it for immediate distribution to the Attorney General's office. Then she showered, dressed in civilian clothes instead of her usual suit, and drove back to Anderson County. The courthouse looked different in daylight, smaller somehow, as if the verdict had deflated its authority. News vans still crowded the parking lot, reporters doing stand-ups in front of the marble steps. But Adrienne avoided them, entering through a side door that Bradley Morris had told her about during one of their conversations. Inside the building felt hollow. Staff moved through hallways with the shell-shocked expressions of people whose daily routines had been revealed as complicity. Some looked ashamed. Others looked angry, as if Adrienne had violated some unspoken contract by forcing them to see what they'd been deliberately ignoring. She found Judge Moreland in her chambers, packing books into cardboard boxes. "Agent Row." The judge looked up, her face drawn. "I'm surprised to see you. Are you resigning?" "I submitted my letter this morning. It seemed appropriate." Adrienne sat down without being invited. "That's not justice. That's avoidance." Moreland's laugh was bitter. "After what came out yesterday, after I admitted to enabling abuse because I was afraid for my career, what else am I supposed to do?" "Stay. Face it. Do better." "I don't deserve—" "This isn't about what you deserve." Adrienne interrupted. "It's about what the system needs. You can walk away. Let someone new come in who doesn't understand the history, who'll spend 2 years learning what you already know. Or you can stay and do the work of actually changing things from the inside." Moreland set down the book she'd been holding. "Why would you want me to stay? I failed. I saw injustice, and I looked away. And now you've seen what looking away costs. That knowledge has value." Adrienne leaned forward. "I don't need judges who've never failed. I need judges who understand exactly how easy it is to fail and choose not to anyway." They sat in silence for a long moment. "The State Judicial Commission is opening an investigation," Moreland said quietly. "I could lose my license to practice law." "You could. Or you could cooperate, fully demonstrate genuine understanding of your failures, and commit to meaningful change. Judges make mistakes. What matters is what they do after." Moreland looked at the boxes half filled with law book symbols of a career she'd been ready to abandon out of shame. "If I stay, people will say I should have been removed, that I don't deserve a second chance." "People say a lot of things. The question is whether you're brave enough to earn that second chance rather than running from the possibility of failure." Adrienne stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Dr. Trenton spent 8 years living with what happened in your courtroom. She carried that weight alone. The least you can do is carry some of it with her by making sure it never happens again." She left Judge Moreland staring at those half-packed boxes, wrestling with the harder path of staying and changing, rather than leaving and forgetting. The administrative offices were in controlled chaos. The county administrator, a man named Gerald Hutchins, who'd been in his position for 16 years, sat behind a desk covered in policy manuals and legal documents. He looked up when Adrienne entered, his expression wary. "Agent Row, I was going to call you." We're implementing immediate changes. New complaint procedures, mandatory body cameras for all courthouse security, quarterly civil rights training." "That's a good start," Adrienne said, sitting across from him. "But I'm here about something else. I want access to every settled lawsuit from the past 20 years. Hutchins' face paled. "Those are confidential. Non-disclosure agreements are void when they're used to conceal civil rights violations. You can give me the files voluntarily, or I can get a federal subpoena. Your choice, but the subpoena comes with additional scrutiny of why you fought so hard to keep them hidden." Hutchins stared at his desk for a long moment, then reached for his phone. "Susan, I need you to pull all settlement files from 2003 forward. Yes, all of them. Bring them to my office." He hung up and looked at Adrienne. "There are 47. 47 settlements in 20 years. 47 that involved courthouse personnel and resulted in non-disclosure agreements. Most were small, $5,000, $10,000. enough to make the problem go away without admitting wrongdoing. And you never questioned why there were so many. Hutchins' silence was answer enough. Over the next 3 hours, Adrienne reviewed 47 stories of small injustices purchased into silence. A woman who'd been called racial slurs by a court clerk. A man who'd been detained for 6 hours after questioning a judge's ruling. A teenager who'd been strip-searched because a bailiff claimed she looked suspicious. Each settlement came with a non-disclosure agreement. Each victim had been paid to forget to be quiet, to let the institution protect itself rather than protect them. Adrienne photographed every document, added them to her evidence file, and sent a summary to the Civil Rights Division with a simple note. This is what systemic failure looks like when you add it up. By noon, she was back in her car, driving through Anderson County's quiet streets, thinking about how injustice became normal through 1,000 small choices to look away, to settle rather than confront, to pay for silence rather than earn trust. Her phone rang. Dr. Trenton. Agent Row, I wanted to let you know I've been contacted by the ACLU, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, and 3 different law schools. They want me to help develop training programs based on what happened here. Are you going to do it? I think I have to. My son is working on federal legislation to reform qualified immunity. I can work on training the next generation of lawyers and judges to recognize these patterns before they become systems. That's good work. There's something else. Dr. Trenton's voice shifted, became more personal. I spoke with several of the women who testified yesterday. We're forming a coalition, Victims of Courthouse Abuse Public Defenders, Civil Rights Attorneys. We're calling it the Last Row Project. We want to create a reporting system for courtroom civil rights violations that bypasses local law enforcement entirely. Adrienne felt something warm settle in her chest. That's exactly what's needed. Accountability that doesn't depend on the people being held accountable. We were hoping you might serve on our advisory board. Not as a spokesperson, I know you're avoiding the spotlight, but as someone who understands how these investigations work, what evidence matters, how to build cases that actually change things. I'll do it, Adrienne said without hesitation. On one condition. No press releases with my name. No promotional materials. I advise I don't perform. Agreed. We're not interested in heroes anyway. We're interested in systems that work. They talked for another 20 minutes about logistics, about how to build reporting mechanisms that protected victims while gathering evidence about how to create accountability structures that couldn't be buried or bought off. When Adrienne hung up, she realized she was smiling for the first time in days. The next 3 weeks were a blur of depositions, policy reviews, and institutional reckonings. Sheriff Thomas Bridges was suspended pending investigation. The county administrator resigned under pressure. 4 other officers from the Anderson County Sheriff's Department were placed on administrative leave while their conduct was reviewed. The state legislature fast-tracked a bill requiring independent review of all courthouse security incidents involving physical contact with citizens. The governor, sensing political opportunity, gave a speech about zero tolerance for civil rights violations, conveniently forgetting that his office had ignored complaints about Anderson County for years. Adrienne watched the political theater with detached amusement. She knew how this worked. Everyone wanted credit for change without accepting responsibility for the failures that made change necessary. But beneath the performative gestures, real work was happening. The FBI opened investigations in 17 other courthouses nationwide where similar patterns had been reported and ignored. The Justice Department's Civil Rights Division created a new task force specifically focused on courthouse abuse. Every federal law enforcement academy in the country received new training materials that included case studies from Anderson County, with Adrienne's encounter with Hale used as a teaching moment about the difference between lawful authority and unlawful coercion. Carmen Rodriguez called to tell Adrienne that she'd been contacted by 3 other women who'd been detained by Hale, but had never reported it because they didn't think anyone would believe them. Now they were coming forward, adding their stories to the growing record of systematic abuse. Rachel Sims was promoted to senior public defender and given authority to create a civil rights advocacy unit within her office. Her first act was to review every case where courthouse security had been involved in the past 5 years, looking for patterns that might indicate similar abuses elsewhere in the system. Bradley Morris, despite his age and retirement, volunteered to train new bailiffs on recognizing the difference between maintaining order and enabling abuse. He gave his first training session with a photograph of Dr. Trenton being dragged from her seat displayed on a screen behind him, a reminder of what happens when good people choose silence over courage. And slowly, quietly, the culture began to shift. It wasn't dramatic. There were no parades, no ceremonies, no moments that would make good television. But in courtrooms across Anderson County and beyond, small changes rippled outward like stones dropped in still water. A bailiff intervened when he saw an officer speaking harshly to a Spanish-speaking defendant, offering translation instead of intimidation. A judge stopped mid-session to remind everyone in the courtroom that questions were welcome, that understanding the process was a right, not a privilege, that dignity wasn't something you had to earn through compliance. A court clerk noticed that complaint forms were being filed, but not processed, and instead of staying quiet, she went directly to the county administrator's temporary replacement and demanded explanation. None of these moments made the news. None of them would become hashtags or viral videos. But each one represented a choice to see, rather than look away, to act, rather than enable to value justice over comfort. 6 weeks after the verdict, Adrienne received a package at her office. Inside was a leather-bound book with her name embossed on the cover. A note from the FBI director's office explained that it was a commendation for exceptional service to be presented at a ceremony in Washington with full press coverage. She put it in a drawer and went back to work. 3 days later, she received an email from Harvard Law School inviting her to give the keynote address at their Civil Rights Symposium. The speaking fee was $20,000 with additional compensation for travel and accommodations. She declined politely and suggested they invite Dr. Trenton instead. A week after that, a production company sent her a contract for a limited series based on her investigation, with a starring role to be played by a prominent actress and a consulting fee that would have paid her salary for 2 years. She deleted the email without responding. Her supervisor finally cornered her in the break room. "Row, you're turning down opportunities that most agents would kill for. The director wants to promote you. Networks want to interview you. You could write your own ticket for the next decade. Why are you hiding?" "I'm not hiding. I'm working." "You're being stubborn." "I'm being careful." Adrienne poured herself coffee from a pot that had been sitting too long. "The moment I become the story stops being about systemic failure and starts being about individual heroism. And individual heroes don't change systems. They just make people feel better about systems that keep failing." Her supervisor shook his head. "You can't control the narrative, Row. The story is already out there. I can control my participation in it. And I choose not to participate in anything that makes what happened about me instead of about the 47 women whose voices were silenced, or the system that silenced them, or the changes we need to prevent it from happening again." She left him standing in the break room, probably thinking she was crazy for turning down fame and fortune. Maybe she was. But she'd seen what happened when justice became spectacle, when meaningful change got traded for feel-good stories about heroes who saved the day. The systems stayed broken. The patterns continued. And the next Bryson Hale operated with impunity, because everyone was too busy celebrating the last one's downfall to build structures that would prevent the next one from rising. 2 months after the verdict, Adrienne received a call from an unknown number. She almost didn't answer, assuming it was another reporter or agent or producer who'd somehow gotten her personal cell. "This is Row." "Agent Row, my name is Michelle Santos, Miguel's mother." Adrienne remembered Miguel, the young man who'd been told to speak English despite having a translator present. "Ms. Santos, how can I help you?" "I wanted to tell you what happened today. Miguel had to go back to court, different matter, parking ticket. He was nervous, scared that it would be like before. But when we got there, everything was different." Different how? There were signs in Spanish explaining the process. The bailiff greeted everyone politely, told us we could ask questions if we didn't understand something. The judge addressed Miguel directly, made sure he had translation, treated him like a person instead of a problem. Michelle's voice thickened with emotion. It seems small maybe, but for Miguel, for me, it meant everything. It meant the system saw us. It meant we mattered. Adrienne felt tears prick at her eyes. That's not small, Ms. Santos. That's exactly what justice looks like when it stops being theoretical. I wanted you to know. What you did, it didn't just change things for Miguel. It changed things for everyone who walks into that courthouse now. We're not invisible anymore. After they hung up, Adrienne sat in her car in the parking lot of the field office, crying for the first time since the investigation began. Not from sadness or frustration or exhaustion, but from relief. The kind of relief that comes when you realize the work actually mattered, that the cost was worth it, that somewhere, a young man could walk into a courtroom and be treated with the dignity that should have been his all along. 3 months after the verdict, every federal law enforcement training academy in the country incorporated what was being called the Anderson Protocol into their curriculum. Recruits learned about implicit bias, about the difference between lawful authority and unlawful coercion, about recognizing when security measures crossed the line into civil rights violations. The case study they used was Adrienne's encounter with Hale, but with her name redacted at her request. The training materials focused on the pattern of abuse, the institutional failures that enabled it, and the structural changes necessary to prevent recurrence. In the section on officer accountability, they included a quote that had been pulled from Adrienne's testimony. It appeared in bold text on a slide that would be shown to thousands of recruits over the coming years. Justice doesn't begin with power. It begins with how we respond to the abuse of power. The quote was attributed simply to Federal Agent Anderson County Investigation. No name, no glory. Just truth offered plainly for anyone willing to hear it. Law schools began using the case in their ethics courses. The full transcript of the hearing was published in several legal journals, with analysis from constitutional scholars about the implications for qualified immunity, police accountability, and institutional reform. Dr. Trenton wrote an article for the Harvard Law Review titled The Erasure Economy: How Non-Disclosure Agreements Enable Systematic Civil Rights Violations. It became required reading in 23 law schools within the first semester of publication. Rachel Sims was invited to speak at the National Association of Public Defenders Conference, where she presented her documentation methods and encouraged other defenders to build similar records when they noticed patterns of abuse. And slowly, case by case, courtroom by courtroom, the machinery of justice began to adjust itself. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't fast. There were setbacks and resistance, and people who insisted that the old ways were fine, that changes were unnecessary, that Adrienne and everyone else involved were making mountains out of molehills. But the truth, once witnessed and documented and made undeniable, had a weight that couldn't be ignored forever. 4 months after the verdict, Adrienne drove back to Anderson County one more time. She parked in the courthouse lot, walked through the marble hallways, and entered courtroom 4B. It was empty, mid-afternoon lull between sessions. The chairs sat in neat rows. The judge's bench loomed at the front. The American flag hung in the corner like it always had. She walked to the back row, to the seat where she'd sat for 6 months, where she'd documented systematic failure, where Bryson Hale had grabbed her arm and revealed himself completely. Someone had placed a small plaque on the back of the chair. Nothing official, probably installed by someone who worked in the building and understood what had happened here. The plaque was simple, just 7 words in plain engraving. Here, someone refused to look away. Adrienne ran her fingers over the letters, thinking about all the women who'd sat in this spot before her, who'd been told their dignity was negotiable, their rights conditional, their stories not worth believing. She thought about Carmen Rodriguez and Dr. Trenton, and Jennifer Wu, and Yvonne Harper, and the 43 others whose names filled 17 boxes of buried complaints. She thought about the young black intern who would someday sit here and not be touched, not be threatened, not be made to feel small because someone with a badge decided she didn't belong. And she understood finally why she'd turned down all the interviews and book deals and speaking tours. Because this wasn't about her. It was about a chair in the last row of a courtroom where the machinery of injustice had run smoothly for 2 decades until someone simply refused to move. It was about every person who'd been told to stand to comply, to make themselves smaller, to accommodate power that had mistaken intimidation for authority. It was about the moment when silence stopped being safe and started being complicit. When looking away stopped being neutral and started being participation in the very systems that needed to be dismantled. Adrienne sat down in the chair, felt the weight of what had happened here, what had changed here, what would continue to change, because of the choice to see rather than ignore. Her phone buzzed. A text from Agent Chen Newcase, flagged in Maryland. Similar pattern. Baltimore Courthouse. Are you interested? She looked at the plaque, at the empty courtroom, at the space where injustice had operated until it couldn't anymore. Then she stood up, straightened her blazer, and typed her response. Send me the details. I'm on my way. Because the work wasn't finished. It would never be finished as long as systems existed that prioritized order over justice, compliance over rights, silence over truth. But now there were witnesses. Now there were records. Now there were people who understood that change didn't come from heroes who saved the day, but from ordinary people who refused to participate in the extraordinary cruelty of looking away. Adrienne walked out of courtroom 4B for the last time, leaving behind the plaque and the chair and the memory of a moment when federal authority met local tyranny and refused to blink. Behind her, the courtroom waited for its next session, its next case, its next opportunity to deliver justice or deny it. But now at least someone was watching. And that made all the difference. The Baltimore case took 3 months to build, and another 2 to prosecute. Similar patterns, different faces, same institutional rot hiding beneath polished marble and procedural language. Adrienne worked it the same way she'd worked Anderson County, documenting everything, saying little, letting the evidence speak for itself. When that case closed with convictions and policy changes, there was another one waiting in Ohio. Then one in Texas. Then Georgia, Michigan, California. Each investigation revealed the same architecture of abuse systems designed to look official while functioning as machinery for maintaining hierarchies that the law had supposedly dismantled decades ago. Adrienne moved through these cases like a surgeon cutting away rot, documenting failure, building records that couldn't be buried or bought off. She declined every interview, every speaking engagement, every opportunity to become the face of reform. Other people could do that work. She had her own to do. 6 months after the Anderson verdict, she received an email from an address she didn't recognize. The subject line read simply, "Thank you." The email was from a woman named Lisa Chen, Officer James Chen's sister. She wrote that her brother had left law enforcement after his testimony, unable to reconcile what he'd been taught with what he now understood about justice. He was going back to school to become a social worker, using his experience to help young people navigate systems that weren't designed with their well-being in mind. The family was proud of him, she wrote, for choosing the harder path of building rather than the easier path of maintaining. Adrienne replied with 3 words. He did good. That same week, she got a call from Carmen Rodriguez, who'd been contacted by a documentary filmmaker interested in telling the stories of the 47 women from the Anderson case. Carmen wanted Adrienne's advice on whether to participate. "What do you want from it?" Adrienne asked. "I want other women to know they're not alone, that what happened to them wasn't their fault, that speaking up matters even when it feels like no one's listening." "Then you should do it. Just make sure the filmmaker understands this isn't about inspiration porn or feel-good narratives. It's about systemic failure and the cost of silence." "Will you be in it?" "No, but that shouldn't stop you from telling your story." Carmen was quiet for a moment. "You know, my daughter asked me the other day what it means to be brave. I told her about you sitting in that courtroom refusing to stand, knowing what would happen, but doing it anyway. I wasn't brave, Adrienne said. I was doing my job. Maybe that's what brave looks like when you strip away the mythology. Just people doing what needs to be done, even when it's hard. The documentary came out 8 months later, titled The Last Row. It premiered at Sundance, won awards, sparked conversations about courthouse reform and qualified immunity, and the ways institutions protect themselves at the expense of the people they're supposed to serve. Adrienne didn't watch it. She was in Detroit by then, building another case, sitting in another courtroom, watching another officer who'd learned that a badge gave him permission to humiliate people who couldn't fight back. The work continued because the work was never finished. But back in Anderson County, something was growing in the spaces where injustice had once operated unchecked. Judge Patricia Moreland had stayed despite the judicial investigation, despite the public scrutiny, despite the voices that said she should have been removed. The State Judicial Commission placed her on probation, required her to complete extensive civil rights training, and assigned a monitor to observe her courtroom for a year. She accepted every condition without complaint. Her first day back on the bench, she addressed a full courtroom with words that had clearly been written and rewritten dozens of times. I failed you. I saw injustice in this courtroom, and I looked away because speaking up felt too dangerous to my career. I prioritized my comfort over your constitutional rights, and I cannot undo that failure. What I can do is commit to doing better, to being better, to creating a courtroom where everyone is treated with the dignity they deserve regardless of their race, language, economic status, or willingness to perform deference to authority. She paused, her voice strengthening. If you see me failing again, you have my permission to call me on it. File complaints, demand accountability. Refuse to let this courtroom become a place where injustice operates in silence. I am here to serve justice, not my ego, and I need your help to do that well. The speech made local news. Civil rights advocates remained skeptical, arguing that pretty words meant nothing without consistent action. But over the following months, Moreland demonstrated through small daily choices that she meant what she said. She interrupted proceedings when she noticed court staff treating defendants dismissively. She personally reviewed every complaint filed about courtroom conduct. She held monthly open sessions where community members could voice concerns about courthouse operations without fear of retaliation. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't enough to erase her past failures. But it was real, sustained, and it changed the culture of her courtroom from a place where power went unchallenged to a place where accountability was expected. Rachel Sims watched the transformation with cautious optimism. Her civil rights advocacy unit had grown from her solo effort to a team of 5 public defenders specifically trained to recognize and document patterns of abuse. They'd filed 14 formal complaints in the first year, resulting in policy changes, additional training requirements, and 2 officers being reassigned away from courthouse duty. We're not perfect, she told a law school class that had invited her to speak about her work. We still miss things. We still have days where we're too tired or too overwhelmed to fight every battle. But we've created a culture where noticing injustice and speaking up about it is expected, rather than punished. That's not heroism. That's just doing the job right. A student raised her hand. But doesn't it get exhausting? Fighting the system every day? Rachel smiled, tired but genuine. It's not fighting the system. It's being the system we wish existed. And yeah, it's exhausting. But you know what's more exhausting? Watching people get hurt by institutions that are supposed to protect them, and telling yourself there's nothing you can do about it. That kind of exhaustion destroys you from the inside out. She thought about the year she'd spent documenting Hale's abuses, while her supervisors told her she was being paranoid, while the Bar Association said she had no standing, while every door she knocked on suggested she was the problem rather than the pattern she'd identified. Someone once told me that change doesn't come from heroes who save the day. It comes from ordinary people refusing to participate in the extraordinary cruelty of looking away. I think about that a lot. Because it means we all have power even when we feel powerless. We have the power to see, to document, to speak, to refuse to pretend that injustice is just the way things are. The students scribbled notes, asked more questions, wanted to know how to build documentation systems and when to file complaints, and how to balance idealism with the practical realities of working within broken institutions. Rachel answered every question, passed out her contact information, told them to reach out when they encountered systems that needed changing. She was building a network, she realized, not of heroes, but of witnesses. People who understood that justice required sustained attention, that change happened through accumulation of small choices to act rather than enable. Meanwhile, Dr. Alma Trenton had returned to teaching, but at a different institution and with a different approach. She'd taken a position at Georgetown Law, where she now taught a seminar called Constitutional Rights in Practice When Theory Meets Reality. The syllabus included case studies from Anderson County, from Baltimore, from every investigation that had followed the pattern Adrienne had first documented. But it also included readings from the 47 settlement agreements, from the training materials that told officers to be firm with black women, from the institutional policies designed to bury rather than address complaints. The law is beautiful on paper, she told her students on the first day of class. The Constitution promises equal protection, due process rights that belong to everyone, regardless of who they are or where they come from. But paper promises don't enforce themselves. They require people willing to recognize when those promises are being broken and brave enough to say so out loud. She told them about being dragged from a courtroom for knowing her rights, about 8 years of silence purchased through a non-disclosure agreement, about the toll that erasure takes on people who are told their dignity doesn't matter enough to protect. I teach this class because I don't want future lawyers to make the mistakes I watched other lawyers make. I don't want you to see injustice and tell yourself it's not your problem, it's not your fight, it's too risky to challenge. I want you to understand that every time you stay silent in the face of abuse, you're participating in a system that will keep hurting people long after you've moved on to other cases. Her students were uncomfortable at first, unused to this level of personal vulnerability from professors who usually maintained careful distance between their experiences and their teaching. But discomfort was the point. Justice required discomfort, required facing the gap between what the law promised and what it delivered. 1 year after the Anderson verdict, the Last Row Project, that Dr. Trenton had helped establish, received its 1,000th report of courthouse civil rights violations. The reports came from across the country, detailing patterns of abuse that had operated in silence because victims didn't know where to report, didn't think anyone would believe them, didn't understand that what happened to them was part of a larger systemic failure. The project's team of volunteer lawyers reviewed every report, identified patterns, and referred credible cases to the FBI, the Justice Department, and state civil rights commissions. They'd helped launch investigations in 37 courthouses, resulted in policy changes in 64 jurisdictions, and created a database of abuses that researchers and advocates could use to identify systemic problems. But the project's most important work wasn't the high-profile investigations. It was the simple act of witnessing, of telling victims that what happened to them mattered, that their stories would be preserved and believed and used to prevent the same thing from happening to others. Dr. Trenton spent hours each week reading reports, her heart breaking at the familiarity of the stories. Women told to stand, to be quiet, to show respect or face consequences. Men detained for speaking Spanish, for asking questions, for failing to perform sufficient deference to authority. Teenagers treated as threats. Elderly people ignored. Disabled individuals denied accommodations because officers couldn't be bothered to adjust their procedures. Each report was different in its details, but identical in its architecture. And each one reminded her why she'd broken her non-disclosure agreement, to testify why the risk of legal consequences mattered less than the moral imperative of speaking truth about systematic abuse. 18 months after the verdict, Adrienne was back in Virginia for a different case, and she found herself with an afternoon free between depositions. Almost without thinking about it, she drove to Anderson County. The courthouse looked the same from the outside, but the atmosphere inside had shifted in ways both subtle and profound. Signage appeared in multiple languages. Staff wore name badges that included their pronouns and job titles. A large poster near the entrance listed rights that all courthouse visitors possessed, including the right to ask questions, request translation, and file complaints without fear of retaliation. Small changes, maybe. But small changes that signaled larger shifts in institutional culture in who the courthouse saw itself serving, in whether it understood its purpose as maintaining order or delivering justice. She didn't go to courtroom 4B. She'd said her goodbye to that space, and her work had moved on to other places where similar systems needed dismantling. But as she walked through the building, she noticed something that made her pause. In the hallway outside the courtrooms, someone had installed a small plaque. It listed the names of everyone who'd testified in the federal hearing, 47 women and men who'd found the courage to speak truth about abuse they'd experienced. At the top of the plaque, engraved in simple letters, was a quote: "Justice doesn't begin with power. It begins with how we respond to the abuse of power." Below it, in smaller text, "In memory of every voice that was silenced, in honor of every person who chose to speak, in commitment to a future where this courthouse serves justice rather than power." Adrienne stood there for a long moment, reading the names, remembering the faces, thinking about the courage it took for each person to come forward, when doing so meant reliving trauma, risking public scrutiny, choosing truth over the easier path of silence. Adrienne Row. She turned. A young black woman stood behind her early 20s, wearing business casual clothes and carrying a leather messenger bag. Her face was familiar in the way that young faces sometimes are carrying echoes of someone else. "I'm sorry. Do we know each other?" Adrienne asked. "Not exactly. I'm Maya Harper, Yvonne Harper's daughter." Adrienne remembered Yvonne detained for 90 minutes for the crime of asking when she could leave. "Your mother testified at the hearing." "She did. And it changed everything for our family. Not just because justice was served, but because she stopped carrying that weight alone. She'd been holding on to what happened for so long, telling herself it didn't matter, that she should just forget about it. Testifying let her release it." Maya smiled, nervous but determined. "I'm actually here for an interview. I'm applying for an internship with the Public Defender's Office. Rachel Sims is hiring summer law students, and I want to be part of what she's building." "That's good work." "I know. My mom told me about what happened in courtroom 4B, about how you refused to stand about everything that came after. I've read all the case materials, watched the documentary, studied the policy changes. I'm writing my law school thesis on institutional reform following civil rights litigation." She paused, gathering courage for whatever she wanted to say next. "I know you don't do interviews or public appearances, but I wanted to tell you, if I ever get the chance, that what you did mattered. Not just because it changed policies or led to convictions, but because it showed people like me that the system can change when someone refuses to participate in its failures." Adrienne looked at this young woman, bright with purpose and determination, preparing to dedicate her career to the same work that had consumed Adrienne's last 2 years. "The system changed because 47 people found their voices," Adrienne said gently. "Because your mother was brave enough to testify. Because Rachel Sims documented abuse when everyone told her she was being paranoid. Because Bradley Morris kept evidence even when staying silent would have been easier. I was just the person who made them look at what they'd been ignoring." "That's what I mean," Maya said. "Sometimes the bravest thing is refusing to let people look away." Adrienne's interview buzzer went off. Time to head back. "Good luck with your interview," she said. "Rachel's doing important work. She needs people who understand why it matters." "Thank you. And Adrienne Row. Thank you for sitting in that last row, for staying in that chair, for not making yourself smaller to accommodate power that should never have existed in the first place." After Maya walked away toward the public defender's offices, Adrienne stood alone in the hallway, looking at that plaque with its list of names and its promise of commitment to change. She thought about all the courtrooms where she'd sat since Anderson County, all the officers she'd documented, all the patterns she'd exposed. She thought about the cases waiting in her inbox, the investigations that would fill the next months and years. The work was endless, because institutional failure was endless, because power always sought to protect itself, because injustice operated most effectively in spaces where people had learned not to see it. But resistance was also endless. As long as there were people like Maya Harper and Rachel Sims and Dr. Trenton and Carmen Rodriguez, people who refused to accept that cruelty was inevitable or that change was impossible, the machinery of justice could be made to work the way it was supposed to. Not perfectly, not quickly, but really sustainably through accumulation of small victories that shifted the ground beneath institutional feet. Adrienne left the courthouse and drove back to Richmond, back to her office, back to the next case that needed building. Behind her, Anderson County continued its slow transformation. The changes weren't complete, weren't guaranteed to last, required constant maintenance and vigilance. But they were real, built on foundation of truth that had been forced into the open and couldn't be buried again. 3 months later, Maya Harper started her internship with Rachel Sims. Her first day, Rachel gave her a tour of the courthouse, explained the new reporting protocols, introduced her to the staff, who'd learned that enabling abuse was no longer an acceptable form of maintaining order. Then Rachel brought her to courtroom 4B. "This is where a lot of what we do began," Rachel said, gesturing to the empty room. "This is where Agent Row refused to stand, where the pattern became undeniable, where silence stopped being an option." Maya walked down the center aisle, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. She reached the back row, the last chair, the seat where Adrienne had sat for 6 months, documenting failure. The small plaque was still there, unofficial, but permanent, marking the space where someone had chosen to see rather than ignore. "Can I sit here?" Maya asked. "You can sit anywhere you have the right to sit," Rachel said. "That's the whole point." Maya sat down in the last row in the chair that had become symbol and reminder and promise. She pulled out her laptop, opened a new document, and began writing notes about the cases she'd be working on, the patterns she'd be watching for, the accountability she'd be helping to build. No one told her to stand. No one questioned her right to be there. No one put their hands on her or suggested that her presence required justification beyond the simple fact of her humanity and her constitutional rights. The courtroom was quiet, except for the soft clicking of her keyboard, the sound of work continuing, of justice being built, one case at a time, through patient accumulation of truth that refused to stay buried. Outside the courthouse, Anderson County went about its business. People came and went, traffic moved through streets, life continued its ordinary rhythm. Most people didn't think about the courthouse or the courtrooms, or the changes that had happened within those marble walls. But for those who needed the justice system to work, for those who'd been told their dignity was negotiable and their rights conditional, the changes meant everything. They meant walking into a courtroom without fear of humiliation. They meant asking questions without being treated as threats. They meant existing in spaces that had once been hostile with the confidence that someone would notice if abuse occurred, that complaints would be taken seriously, that silence was no longer the price of survival. Small changes maybe when measured against the scale of injustice that still existed in the world. But everything to the people, those changes protected. In courtroom 4B, Maya Harper sat in the last row, working on cases that would help ensure other young people like her didn't have to experience what her mother had experienced, didn't have to carry the weight of systematic abuse, didn't have to wonder if speaking up would matter. The chair beneath her was just a chair, wood and vinyl and municipal furniture. But it was also testament to the power of refusing to move, of insisting on rights that power wanted to make conditional, of choosing to see injustice, even when looking away would be easier. No plaque explained this to her. No sign told her the history. But she knew it anyway, because her mother had told her, because the story had been preserved and passed down, because truth had been forced into the open and couldn't be erased again. She sat in that chair and did her work, and in doing so, she honored every person who'd sat there before her and paid the price for believing that justice was supposed to protect everyone equally. The room was quiet. The work continued. And in that continuation, in that ordinary daily choice to do the job right, rather than the job easy, justice survived not as abstraction or aspiration, but as practiced reality. Adrienne Row was hundreds of miles away by then, building another case, sitting in another courtroom, documenting another pattern that needed exposing. She would never know about Maya Harper sitting in that chair, never see how her refusal to stand had created space for a whole new generation to sit without fear. But that was fine. The work had never been about recognition or credit or having her name attached to change. It had been about making sure that change happened, that it lasted, that it became woven into institutional fabric too deeply to be easily removed when cameras stopped watching. In Anderson County, in Baltimore, in Detroit, in every courthouse, where investigations had forced systems to face themselves, small daily victories accumulated into cultural transformation. Officers who'd learned that badges gave them permission to humiliate learned instead that badges carried responsibility to protect. Judges who'd looked away because intervention felt risky learned that looking away was riskier still, that complicity carried costs that couldn't be offset by career advancement. Staff who'd buried complaints because maintaining order seemed more important than delivering justice learned that order without justice was just organized cruelty. And citizens who'd been told their dignity was negotiable learned that rights belonged to them not as privileges to be earned, but as foundations that systems were obligated to protect. The transformation wasn't complete. It would never be complete as long as humans ran institutions, and institutions protected power, and power sought to maintain itself through hierarchies that the law had supposedly dismantled. But it was real. And it started with a woman in a red blazer sitting in the last row of a courtroom refusing to stand, refusing to disappear, refusing to let a system designed to look away keep operating in comfortable silence. That woman had moved on to other work now, other courtrooms, other patterns that needed exposing. But the chair remained. Empty most days, occupied sometimes by people who knew the story, and sometimes by people who didn't. Either way, it stood as quiet reminder that justice doesn't need names engraved on plaques or statues erected in public squares. It only needs someone willing to sit in that space and refuse to move until truth is seen, documented, and made undeniable. The chair waited. The work continued. And somewhere someone sat down in a seat they had every right to occupy, and no one pulled them away.